HanselMinutes.com. It's Hansel Minutes, a weekly discussion with web developer and technologist Scott Hanselman. This is Lawrence Ryan announcing show number 219, recorded live Thursday, June 24th, 2010. Support for Hansel Minutes is provided by Telerik RAD Controls, the most comprehensive suite of components for Windows Forms and ASP.NET web applications. Online at www.telerik.com. In this episode, Scott demystifies Microsoft's application server AppFabric with Karandeep Anand.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes, and I'm on the phone today with Karandeep Anand, who's a principal GPM at Microsoft Corporation, and he's going to talk to me about the AppFabric today. Thank you, sir, for taking time to chat with me.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
All right, so I'm up on the Microsoft website, and I typed in msdn.com/AppFabric, and I see that there appear to be two different things that are called AppFabric. I see a Windows Server AppFabric and a Windows Azure AppFabric. I know what Server is, and I know what Azure is, but what are the two products called AppFabric, and are they the same thing or different?
Today, we have two offerings for AppFabric brand. First is, of course, the Windows Server AppFabric, as just mentioned. We also have the Windows Azure AppFabric, and the intent of the two technologies is similar, which is we give you a bunch of application server building blocks for you to easily build applications. However, today the two offerings have different capabilities. So the Windows Azure AppFabric is about helping you build applications, leveraging the cloud infrastructure and using connectivity or access control. So the two big offerings within the Azure AppFabric. And the Windows Server AppFabric, on the other hand, is today focused on providing containers for writing your own code or caching technologies, which is the code named Velocity. And today these are two different offerings and capabilities, but our intent is for these to converge over time. And then AppFabric eventually becoming the application server technologies set from Microsoft, both in the server framework as well as in the cloud.
I see. I've heard a lot of questions where people kind of get confused, myself included, where they think that these are currently the same thing, and they want to know why they're named the same thing. So I'm hearing you say that they are named the same thing because it is the intent that they'll share componentry. There'll be feature parity, for lack of a better word, between these two things at some point in the future.
The intent is to get to convergence of the same technology stack, both on premises and on the cloud.
Okay. So then that tells me something then. Just as a person looking in, that AppFabric, that word, that kind of brand, that must be our application server. Because I used to work in finance for many, many years, and my conversation as I would go and talk to vice presidents of banks would usually start with, hi, we use Windows, and Windows doesn't have a component container or any kind of application server, so we wrote our own. And I worked for a company that wrote a big application server. And we would go and compete against JBoss and WebSphere. Is AppFabric our app server now?
In a short answer, I would say yes, AppFabric is the app server from Microsoft. And historically, just to add more context to it, is we've always had a great set of technologies for the application server space. Our frameworks, namely the .NET framework, is way ahead of its competition and what we have to offer to developers. And historically, we've had Windows Server as the application server, and on top of that, IIS, our being a web server, also doubled as an app server for middleware. But with AppFabric, what we've done is we've taken the IIS and the Windows Server as the base platform and enhanced it even further to actually give a full application server as industry understands it today with JBoss or with WebSphere, you name it. I mean, the same concept. But yes, this is the first incarnation of a full-blown application server stack from Microsoft.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the services or the features that someone looks at when they want an application server?
I believe at the highest level, the two ways to think about it. One is, as a developer, I get a whole bunch of tools and I get a bunch of programming languages and frameworks. That's traditionally been our strongest point with Visual Studio and with .NET Framework. That and .NET Framework being a part of Windows now, Windows 2008 R2, gives a pretty strong foundation of where we are with the base frameworks. What AppFabric adds on top of that is a set of technologies or building blocks so that developers can focus on writing business logic and application logic as opposed to having to worry about how my app server, the lifetime, the components would really run and scale. That is where AppFabric as an app server layer gives you two key sets of technologies. First one is hosting and management of your services. And in particular, this being any .NET 4.0 and above written technology stack in WCF and workflows. And the second set of technologies, which are in some sense slightly different than hosting code and writing code, is a big building block that we see most applications requiring. It's a set of caching technologies, formerly codenamed Velocity, to enable writing scalable and very fast access applications, specifically for your web-based apps like ASP.NET. So, in short, there are two big sets of technologies with AppFabric. One is your hosting and management of services, and second is caching of data for writing scalable web applications.
Okay. A lot of people just run their app. They just have a simple app or even not a simple app. They just run their app on IIS 7. How do I know when I'm outgrowing my application and I'm going to need to start thinking about introducing a more formalized AppFabric of application server?
That's a good one. And that's typically, you being very nice to us, Scott, typical question is, why do you really need AppFabric? I can go start.
You read through my question.
I get that all the time. I mean, if you look at it historically, right, you would start with, I have a bunch of code, and I've written my business logic. Now I just need a way to host it. Sure, a lot of people would go write a simple NT service, host it in Scum, and say, I'm going to write it. And as soon as this application or code becomes anything meaty or meaningful, you start writing a lot of logic and code to maintain that NT service and say, I'm going to worry about restartability. I'm going to worry about how it starts automatically on the machine boot. How does it fail over? How does it persist state? And if you really look at the investments at this point a developer is making, is very little to do with the business logic itself. You're really spending a lot of time in writing a basic framework of how to run services. Along came IIS, and with its simple WAS activation, it took away a lot of the complexity from developers to write basic lifecycle management. Of course, IIS is designed for writing great web applications. If you're writing longer-running services, you need additional help to manage long-running processes or to manage state of those processes. That's where AppFabric comes in and does what IIS did for basic lifecycle management of your components, to take it further and say, if you really have applications running in IIS, you need longevity, you need state maintenance, you need persistence, you need better monitoring of those. That's what AppFabric does. And our intent is that if we give you these building blocks, you don't really need to worry about writing the basics and the plumbing of how to run an app. What you need to focus on as a developer is really how to get my business logic and my application logic focused on what my customers need more than what my infrastructure needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I was working in banking, one of the things that we would bump into is the people we were trying to sell to would say something like, well, this is all great, but aren't you in the business of banking? Why are you bothering with component lifetime management and state management and configuration settings for services? This was all stuff that we had to build when we were just trying to write a banking application. It had nothing to do with banking. I mean, it was a completely generic application server that honestly was taking time away from the time we should have been spending writing banking applications. And we always used to joke that we wanted to do refactoring via subtraction. meaning that whenever Microsoft would come out with something that would do what we needed it to do already, then we could just throw away something that we wrote and start worrying about the business problem.
And that's true. And for any professional developer to actually go write a lot of that logic every time, it's just time consuming and takes away a big chunk of your productivity towards these basic repetitive tasks. The interesting add-on to that is it's not just at the development time that you're paying this huge cost. What you're also doing is once you have a successful application running, then you need to go help your operations or your monitoring teams or whoever's really managing this app to start building a lot of instrumentation, a lot of code to, spit out debugging information, tracing information, logging stuff. And every time you build an app, you have to do that yourself because there is no consistent framework or an automated thing to give basic monitoring and troubleshooting information out to your ops team. And that's one of the other things that we've done really well with .NET Photo. And what AppFabric enables on top of that is once you have an app running, we automatically are able to dial up and dial down the troubleshooting levels. So you can get basic health information, error information, and all the way up till full troubleshooting logs just by turning on a few knobs. So not only did you save a lot of time during development to not write basic lifecycle management, you don't have to invest as much in writing the basic monitoring and troubleshooting plumbing into your code anymore because the way .NET Photo is wired and what AppFabric can enable on top of it can help you spit out and reduce your overhead of writing the monitoring and troubleshooting code as well.
See, that actually brings up two interesting points, I think. First is, I always used to find myself writing logging and instrumentation code, but I'd end up putting it in a database or putting it in a log file. And even now, years later, after I've left this banking company, you'll find operations guys, poking around inside of a half dozen log files trying to figure out what went wrong when they really wish that they could be inside of IIS Manager or inside of some MMC snap-in. Which brings me to my second point, which is that I pretty much just assumed that AppFabric was just the new name for Velocity, the new name for our caching. But as you listed out, there's a bunch of different things. So we should go through that. So you talked about monitoring. There's like a dashboard, isn't there? Or like an AppFabric dashboard that the operations guys can look at and see all sorts of information about my services.
Correct. Actually, AppFabric is Velocity, which is caching, and then a big set of investments on top of IIS, which is the AppFabric dashboard and AppFabric plumbing that helps you do both hosting of custom code as well as hosting and management of the same application via a very, very familiar UI, which is your IIS, INET Manager itself. So the second element that we were talking about, the AppFabric dashboard, this is simple to use, out of the box, configure dashboard, which helps you look at the existing services you've deployed, talks to a single centralized database, pulls out all the information, error logs, eventing information, monitoring information, and can give you simple queries out of the box or help you author advanced queries, which your ops team can go look and debug information using. So this is through the life cycle of an application. It's a great set of technologies for your developers to use with the basic hosting code and basic debugging information that even developers can use. Then it's a great UI tooling as well as a great single centralized database-based location for storing all your monitoring and debugging and troubleshooting information into a single location with a UI, which is the dashboard, to go query and manage it in the day-to-day operations lifecycle aspect of your application. And the same information can then go get fed back into the development lifecycle so that you know where your applications typically fault or where your performance is bad or what are typical events that you see so that you can actually close that loop and improve your application in the next round based on the historical information you've been collecting and storing using AppFabric.
Hi, this is Scott. I just want to remind you guys that there's no show without a sponsor. Somebody's got to pay for all this bandwidth, and the more popular the show becomes, the more important it is that we thank our sponsors folks like Telerik. Now, I want to let you guys know that Telerik has got a pretty cool deal going between June 1st, 2010 and August 31st, 2010. Any interested listener, just send an email to podcast@Telerik, TELERIK.com, mention Hansel Minutes, and they will reply and they'll give you a special $50 off coupon code. So just remember, podcast@Telerik.com, mention Hansel Minutes, $50 off. This goes until August 31st, 2010. And big thanks again for the folks at Telerik for believing in our show and for continuing to help pay for our expenses. So what does this change? Is this a library or is this a new service? To get these features, am I hosting my services in a different place? What are the hosting services that make this possible?
Actually, I should have probably started with that. To get Windows Server AppFabric, it's a Windows component, and you need to download from Microsoft.com/AppFabric website the package which installs AppFabric on your Windows Server. So there's no extra licensing or extra things you need to go buy. You just go download this package called a Fabric Server package and just install it on any Windows Server box. What it actually does is it goes and sits on top of IIS, so it enables IIS. It asks you to provision or point towards SQL database that we can use. If you already have a SQL server, you can point Windows Server AppFabric's install to that server, so we can go create a monitoring and a persistence database for you automatically. Once the configuration is done, then you continue using the same ways of developing an application as you did on IIS and host it in IIS. The only difference is that with the AppFabric dashboard, you now have a UI for configuration management as well as for monitoring those applications. So in addition to just the IIS enhancements and a bunch of UI tooling, a couple of interesting knobs there to go improve the manageability of your application by turning on things like Auto Start. Auto Start is a simple one where every time your machine needs to get rebooted or started again, what AppFabric does is it kicks in a timer, it starts those services automatically for you so that your first time experience of using a service is pretty quick. You're not waiting for the whole machine and the state to get it initialized. AppFabric's already done that for you. So things like those are enhancements on top of the core IIS hosting infrastructure itself to make managing of these services a lot more easier. So it's not a different DLL, it's not a different code, it's not a different way of thinking about it. It's the same way of how you develop a WCF or a WF application using .NET Photo, using your favorite tools, hosting it on IIS, and you just get a whole bunch of this plumbing for free.
I see. So then, just as like JBoss extends Apache, and if I'm using Apache and I love Apache and I switch and I start using JBoss, it's not that I have to completely learn something new. So if I like IIS 7 and I start doing things on AppFabric, it's going to feel like it's an extension of IIS 7. It's not going to feel like a whole new universe.
Exactly. We don't want people to go learn yet another paradigm or figure out yet another way of building an application. We just extend the way they build services today, but just give them a whole bunch of frameworks and tools to just make them a lot more productive.
Okay. So there's health monitoring and the monitoring dashboard, and that lets you see, logs and health issues and anything that a WCF, a Windows Communication Foundation, or a WF, or what Microsoft people call WF, a workflow service. That's all automatic. So if I have a WCF service now, or I have a workflow service now, all that health data is generated automatically. It's just going to work, and I don't have to do anything. So I get monitoring of services effectively for free. Exactly.
And I'm glad you asked about WF, as we like to call it, or workflow. There are a couple of other things that we do for workflow in particular is, if you're familiar with how you write simple workflows or, fairly complex stateful workflows, you would need to persist the state of your workflow at every checkpoint or an activity. And typically configuring a persistence database, putting checkpoints, making sure your state of your workflow is maintained and you can restart from that point onwards is fairly a complex task. With the enhancements in .NET 4.0 and all the work around persistence there, coupled with the fact that AppFabric configures a persistence database for you by default, and multiple workflow instances can use the same database, you get a lot of tools and capabilities to manage workflows a lot better and a lot easier as well. Just because you've used .NET 4.0, you get all the other persistence capabilities, the ability to go start a workflow instance, stop a workflow instance, look at a suspended workflow instances, all out of the box just because you're using AppFabric.
Right. In business, a lot of services are long running. We had this in banking when we were doing bill payments and funding. Not everything can be done in a second. So when you have a long running workflow, you need to basically hydrate it and dehydrate it and, effectively suspend and resume and manage the lifetime of that workflow. And you really quickly get into things that don't have anything to do with your business, but have a lot to do with administration. I call it administrivia of these things. Yes,
and AppFabric just makes it a lot easier, building on top of the investments that the frameworks team has made in .NET 4.0-based workflows. So we just give you a lot of tools out of the box, easy for administrators to actually use and learn, to monitor those workflows, stop them, troubleshoot them as well.
Okay. So I've got my application has its own database for doing whatever my application does. I get a persistence storage for managing the instance lifetime. We've got health monitoring services and things like that. What about configuring? What about sharing settings between WF services and WCF services?
Actually, that's usually the biggest pain that we've seen with most applications which need to host on an infrastructure like IIS or any web stack for that matter. We do heavily fall back and depend on the IIS configuration itself, because I think the IIS team has finally got it nailed on how to manage configuration at the machine level. So you have policies at the machine level that you can enforce, and then you have a great concept of application pools, and you can have configurations and throttling encoders at that level. And then your application's configuration itself is just a simple config file where you can author that outside and maintain it outside of your application code itself and use it. And what AppFabric does is it helps you with that configuration using the same IIS configuration concept and underlying stack, which is you have machine config and you have web.config to manage the configuration of your end-to-end application. So you get basic configuration support ability via the AppFabric dashboard.
Oh, so it's all inside the dashboard. So managing a service in the dashboard looks the same as managing a site.
Correct.
All right, cool.
That's a simple way to put it. So what we did for services, what IIS does for your site.
Oh, that's cool. That's a good way to put it. Okay, I'm in my mind, I'm listing out kind of all the things that I had to do at my last job and seeing if I can get rid of as much of these as possible. The other thing that I had to do was I had to write a bunch of PowerShell tasks to manage our services. This was right when PowerShell came out, so it was a little controversial, and a lot of people didn't know about PowerShell. But I basically automated a bunch of stuff, managing health data, monitoring data, starting and stopping services. What kind of PowerShell love can you give me here?
I'm a huge fan of PowerShell. So let me put my bias out there before I answer that question. So in general, what we are seeing across Microsoft, the principle we're following is that if you can do it through UI, you should be able to do it through PowerShell. And I'm glad that the team actually followed that principle for AppFabric all up. And in fact, there are more things you can do probably through PowerShell than what you can do from even dashboard. And we've made sure that everything you can do through a dashboard, which is setting up the services, monitoring the services, being able to spit out the status of any of the workflow instances, look at troubleshooting logs, all that can actually be done through PowerShell so that if you want to build your own custom dashboards, or if you want to integrate with your operations tools, or if you want to be able to build a larger portal for your application, as the banking industry that you talked about, I'm pretty sure they have a lot of different frameworks and tools already in place. And for them to really go fire up IIS every time they need to go look at something might not be an acceptable thing. So what we did was, all the cool stuff that we built in the dashboard, we enabled it through PowerShell completely so that you can build your own company-specific, company-loved and professed dashboard tooling and integrate AppFabric capabilities into that using PowerShell.
Oh, okay, so I could write my own UI, my own GUI even, and then call the PowerShell stuff by hosting PowerShell commandlets within my management application. Exactly.
And we've gone through the pain of making sure that pretty much everything we get through UI, we get through PowerShell. So you won't be short-charged there.
That's cool. All right, and then the thing that we actually haven't really talked too much about was formerly codenamed Velocity, which is our distributed caching. And that's baked into AppFabric as well.
Yes. Actually, these were earlier two different technologies that people used to understand as codenamed Dublin, which was all the technologies we just talked about around hosting, management, troubleshooting, and config. And then
so that was
codenamed Velocity. That was Dublin, yes. So we had two cool codenames, Dublin and Velocity, and we've finally got them together because we figured that our web developers and app developers can actually use both of them together and call them AppFabric as signaling the first application server from Microsoft.
Okay, and this works in client Windows 7 and Vista for developers, but this runs on Windows Server 2008, both Service Pack 2 and Windows Server 2008 R2. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes. So the AppFabric itself is an extension or an add-on, or actually technically it's an optional component on top of Windows Server itself. So if you have Windows Server 2008 SP2, and if you have Windows Server 2008 R2, you already are entitled or already have the license for AppFabric. So, and these are two platforms it can run on. You don't need to do anything special to go buy it or license it or figure out how to get it. You just get it through this download package, which we released about 2 weeks ago at TechEd. So it's available publicly now. People can go download, install, and play with it.
Here we go. So now I get to nail you down. So this is released. This is not like, because it kind of felt like it was in a permanent beta, but this is done.
This is done in its first version, yes.
Excuse me. Yeah, see. So version 1 is done, and this is a part of Windows. So it's supported. If I call and I say I'm running Windows Server 2008 R2, I'm using AppFabric, they're going to know what I mean, and I'm going to be as supported as anything else on Windows.
Exactly. This is no longer a download you play with. It's no longer a Codeplex tool thingy that you just can get and experiment with. This is actually a full Windows Server component. You get the full Windows Server support. You can call PSS and get help.
Okay. Now, for people who are using 2003, this is not something that runs on Windows Server 2003, but I did notice that if you are a client of the distributed cache, so if you have some existing services in 2008, 2003 servers that you have already can talk to that distributed cache with a downloadable little piece that lets 2003 servers talk to Velocity.
Interesting, Scott. You know all our little secrets. So yes, we made a separate download available specifically for customers who are still in the migration phase of moving from Windows 2003 based web servers to Windows 2008. What we did was give them an easier path of migrating and telling them what is available with Windows 2008 when they upgrade completely. So when you download the Windows Server AppFabric package, you don't get that client, but there is a separate download available for that class of customers to just help them ease the migration process and to use distributed cache from the Windows 2003 based web servers. So it's an interim thing that we hope people can use for short term and help them migrate to Windows 2008 eventually.
Yeah, I mean, for me as a developer, the reason to go to 2008 or go to Windows 7 is IIS 7. I mean, just IIS 7, and I'm saying this as a developer more than I am a paid Microsoft shill, but IIS 7 is so much better than IIS 6, so you definitely want to get on IIS 7 if you can. But if you have an existing application that you just, for whatever reason, the boss insists that it runs on Server 2003, it's nice to know that you could take advantage of that distributed caching on your 2008 machines, kind of remotely from your 2003 machine that you're maybe in the process of doing a migration on. I just thought that was a nice nod to the people who are doing that because, we tend to come out with stuff very quickly. And it's cool that even though Windows Server 2003 is 7 years old, that this interim thing exists.
Correct. And yes, and in the support lifecycle of this is the support lifecycle of Windows 2003. So I think we still have a few more months. I don't remember the date anymore, but of Windows 2003 support. So I'm hoping that people can use it till then and use this component and quickly migrate for reasons you just described to Windows 2008 and IIS 7.
Mm-hmm. So let me think there if there's anything I've forgotten. So there's a management pack if you're using Operations Manager that you can actually manage AppFabric within that as well, right?
Correct. So if you have investments in Operations Manager, System Center, you can actually use the management pack. And what that really does is it gives you the AppFabric dashboard-like capabilities of doing monitoring. Why are your System Center's Operation Manager UI? So you get a lot of that. And in addition to that, because the management pack is sitting outside the box itself, it can also do health monitoring of the server itself and the database as well. So management pack, the way to think about it is what the AppFabric dashboard provides you for monitoring, plus, because it can also do machine or server management or server monitoring for the AppFabric server as well.
Mm-hmm. So folks can go to msdn.com/appfabric to get this, but is it true they can also get it inside of the web platform installer?
That is. So in fact, I personally always use the web platform installer on my developer machine just to get started. And when I'm actually deploying applications, then I actually go use the full setup and the download package. But WebPI is so cool. It just automates the whole process for me that I can click start, it installs SQL Express, it installs the AppFabric bits, configures IIS, ready to go with it once I'm back with my coffee.
Yeah, during some of the betas and CTPs, I found Velocity and AppFabric difficult to install, but the final release is actually not difficult at all. I was able to put it together in about 10 minutes, and it's even faster being able to just go into the web platform installer and add it from there. So, yeah, if you can use the web platform installer, it's definitely considerably easier.
Absolutely. And while we didn't get a lot of time to talk about the distributed cache today, but I believe, Scott, you already had a nice long conversation with Anil on this in the past. But
yes,
I would strongly recommend looking at the caching, and I think that's probably the coolest thing you would have seen on Microsoft platform, which signals our intent for our future roadmap as well. And taking a few minutes just to quickly describe what is so special about distributed cache.
Mm-hmm.
It actually builds on an architecture, what I personally like to call the cloud architecture, and available on premises, which is instead of setting up clustering or other ways of achieving high availability, which are great for the workloads I work on today, but things like caching, which are stateful things, you have data you're storing in cache. At the same time, you need availability very quickly and cheaply. So instead of relying on other older different ways of actually achieving that high availability, what we've done is we've used a lot of the same concepts that power our SQL Azure infrastructure in Velocity, which is distributed cache, and made a highly available and a distributed cache available on premises. So setting up a 5-node cache or a 10-node cache and setting up in a high availability configuration, it's all a matter of just adding more nodes. You don't have to worry about how to manage a cache cluster, how to configure it, how to manage the uptime and availability. A lot of those problems have been abstracted and moving away from the administration experience down to the platform itself. So what cache builds on today, I'm hoping will be the substrate for building all our future technologies which need to scale up and still provide the high availability needs. So from that perspective, just wanted to put that small plug in saying, if you're interested in knowing what's coming in future from AppFabric, Velocity or the distributed cache is a great architecture and technology signaling our intent for building large-scale, highly available, very elastic, and redundant capabilities of compute onto the rest of our stacks of AppFabric and App Server technologies.
Yeah, and like you said earlier, the best part of it all is that you don't have to buy anything, in the sense that if you have a licensed server, you already have this. So, yeah, if you need a memory server, especially one that has high availability, which is a feature that isn't available in some other memory server products, then definitely check out Velocity inside of AppFabric.
Correct. And you'll be amazed at how easy it is to use, because when I built my first application, I was just doing a simple ASP.NET, talking to a SQL database, using both SQL for both my sessions data as well as for actual data. Switching to Velocity, I thought I'd be spending a lot more time on actually setting up and configuring Velocity as opposed to writing application logic. And the switch to setting up a 2-node simple cluster and getting it to use the cache, it was so easy. And with the out-of-box ASP.NET session state provider that we ship, switching from using SQL or something else you might be using today to using Velocity as your ASP.NET session state provider was simple and very quick. So we have that available out of the box for people to make that switch today. In addition, you can use the distributed cache for storing any other data that you might want to make available next to your web tier or your application tier, and still access that while accessing the database in parallel, or reduce the need to access the database that frequently.
Very cool. Well, I'll add links to everything, including white papers and where people can download stuff, in the show notes. And thank you so much, Karandeep Anand from the Distributed Application Server Group, for taking time to chat with me today.
Thanks for having me, Scott. It was a pleasure.
This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and I'll see you again next week.